Now, we talked earlier in the show about the United Nations Secretary General, the socialist Antonio Guterres, and his scaremongering at this UN climate conference.
It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
And I was naturally wondering why he could say something so stupid, so false, so childish. And then I thought, well, maybe it's no wonder when this 20-year-old is one of the climate advisors to this UN boss. She's Sophie Kiani, an American. She's a member of Guterres' Youth Advisory Committee. And I wonder what he sees in this young climate activist, now that he's moved on from being advised by the even younger teenage Greta Thunberg. But this 20-year-old actually scolds in exactly Thunberg's language. It's like they've got the same script.
What language do we need to translate the climate data into for you to take action? Because if you did have the information and you were only pretending to take action, that would be unforgivable.
So why? Why a 20-year-old who hasn't even graduated from a university, why is she advising anyone at all, except perhaps on fashion or beauty tips? But here's the wild thing. Sophia Kiani has had a meeting also with President Joe Biden's climate change envoy, John Kerry. She's hobnobbed with billionaire publisher Michael Bloomberg. She's been on a climate panel for the UN. She's been promoted by UNICEF, which is the UN's top children's agency, and she's addressed businessmen at an event hosted by the left-wing Washington Post and another at the left-wing New York Times. And no doubt all the people there were so glad to see someone with such tremendous command of the global warming science. Joining me is Tom Slater, editor of the Online Spiked, which is right on top of the political and cultural debates. Tom Slater, this Sophia Kiani, why would she be an advisor to the UN Secretary General on global warming and not, I don't know, you or me?
It's a big question. I mean, that photo of Guterres and Kiani together, it does sort of scream billionaire remarries for the fourth time. Sort of the optics of it are slightly strange. But at the same time, I think the thing you do get is there is this sort of cult of youth when it comes to not just the climate issue, but all kinds of issues, where young people are sort of used as the knowers, the seers. I mean, Greta peak was almost treated like a kind of young prophetess of doom. It was very strange and cultish, but I think it's also quite cynical, really. It's using what is perceived to be the general view amongst young people and these kind of hand-picked, photogenic young representatives in order to essentially hammer home the beliefs that people like Antonio Guterres and others have held for a long time. It's just a way of kind of morally blackmailing everyone else into their own preferred course for eco-austerity. But it has just turned into a big racket now where, again, if you kind of can get enough Instagram followers and get yourself into the right kinds of meetings, you can just be on this kind of global circuit forever, it seems like.
Oh, and you can feel like you're changing the world, you're very important. It's such a fraud because really what they're doing is they're picking kids who will say exactly the lines that have been coached by these same people and present them as their own independent thinking when it's not. If they deviated from that script by a second, that'd be as ignored as, well, you are, Tom. You're not standing next to Guterres prattling his lines. They're never going to ask you.
Well, exactly. And this is it, isn't it? It is just a kind of act, really. You know, we're listening to the children. We're listening to the young people. You're listening to certain kinds of young people. I mean, they're not going to necessarily hear from young entrepreneurial people in Africa who really want their countries to develop and don't buy any of this green nonsense. But I think when it comes to Generation Z or Z or the Zoomers, what you want to call it, some even anecdotal data at the moment seems to suggest they're not nearly as kind of right on politically correct, woke on green issues and others than people seem to believe. So it'd be interesting to see as they kind of come to political maturity, whether they'll be as useful as sort of political battering rams going forward, if you like.
But I notice, this also shows that the UN is very much pitching its message at the young, who are more impressionable, more inclined to freak at scare campaigns. This is really very cynically aimed at them. A few facts, lots of fear. But you mentioned cult of youth. And speaking of that, another story. One of the most admired young businessmen in the world until just the other day was Sam Bankman-Fried. He's still just 30 years old. He's American, ran a cryptocurrency business, was worth $40 billion. I think about last week he was worth about that, and had all the right slogans. Here he is.
But Sam is not a traditional billionaire because he believes in the concept of earn to give.
The amount of good that you can do for the future of the world is really large, and it's way more than you can do to actually make yourself happy with anything like that amount of money.
And he is funding everything you can think of. Global warming.
It's one of the biggest problems that we have to tackle together as a world.
Another thing he funded, of course, was the US Democrat Party, Joe Biden, $50 million in their midterm election campaign that's just been run. He now seems to have lost his entire fortune. His entire business is $40 billion of money. And a business, by the way, that was run in large part by an unusually young woman who was his former girlfriend. Can you explain to me, Tom, why so many business leaders and so many investors trusted such young people with so many billions of dollars thinking they knew what they were doing?
Well, I think this is what you see in the tech world more broadly, which is that you have essentially kind of credulous older investors who are taken for a bit of a ride, really, by kind of these young would-be hotshots. I mean, the stories that you hear about Bankman-Fried are fascinating. There's one in the BBC was reporting on this morning, talking about how he had a habit of playing video games during even quite important high-level calls, and Sequoia Capital, who ended up giving $200 million to his particular venture, at one point were kind of posted a blog post saying, isn't this crazy? He was playing this game whilst we were talking to him, almost as if, isn't it brilliant? This is the youth. These are the people who understand the tech world. And yet, as you say, it's collapsed in pretty short order, largely because that affiliated trading firm to FTX, Alameda Research, run by that young woman, Caroline Ellison, was effectively, taking customer accounts from FTX and using it to fund quite risky bets. So, but this is thing we've seen time and time again, where you have essentially these young hotshots who claim they've got the next big idea. They can get hundreds of millions of dollars in investment in a very short period of time before they can collapse almost as quickly, because you've basically got a lot of older people on those calls who don't really understand the tech involved, don't really understand where this stuff is going, and just take these people's word for it, basically.
And it also seems to me that the youth is, in fact, one of the qualifications when it should have big alarm. Only someone young. It's like if something breaks that involves technology, call someone young. They must know. I think that's the thing here. Tom Slater, thank you so much indeed for your time. Talking about the colour youth, I had to laugh at new research, a new poll out of 200 Australian employers. They had a look at Gen Z, the youngest generation. They're twice as likely as anyone else to take a sickie. Can you believe that?